Long before any other people knew this land existed, it was already home. For more than 65,000 years, the first peoples of Australia lived here. This is a history so long it is hard to imagine. It is a story written in the rocks, the rivers, and the stars. These were the world's first explorers. They were the first to cross the open sea to find a new continent. They walked across this vast country, from the snowy mountains to the dry, red deserts. They learned its secrets. They understood its rhythms. This was not an empty land waiting to be found. It was a land that was known, loved, and cared for by hundreds of different nations of people. These first peoples were not just wandering hunters. They were farmers and builders. They had complex societies with laws and trade routes that crisscrossed the entire continent. They built dams to manage water and harvest fish. They planted fields of yams and grains, feeding many people. They lived in permanent villages with strong houses made from stone and wood. They managed the land with fire, using it carefully to encourage new growth and help animals to thrive. This was a sophisticated way of life, built on deep knowledge passed down through thousands of generations. It was a civilization that lived with the land, not just on it. The evidence of this long and rich history is everywhere. You can see it in the ancient rock art galleries, some of the oldest in the world. These paintings tell stories of creation, of law, and of daily life. You can find it in the stone tools, carefully shaped for specific jobs. You can see it in the fish traps, constructions of stone that have stood for thousands of years, still working today. These are not just relics of the past. They are proof of a clever and enduring culture. They show a deep understanding of science, engineering, and the environment. This history challenges the old story of a simple, wandering people. It tells a truer, more complex story. When the first ships from Europe arrived, they did not find an empty wilderness. They found a continent that was fully occupied, a land managed and shaped by human hands for millennia, a place where every mountain, river, and waterhole had a name and a story. The people who lived here had a history longer than any other on Earth. They were the original Australians. Their story is the first chapter of this country's history, and it is the most important. It is the foundation upon which everything else has been built. Understanding this long history is the only way to understand the country that Australia is today. The life of the first peoples was woven together with the land, their spirituality, and their laws. At the heart of it all was the dreaming. The dreaming is not just a collection of stories from long ago, it is a living thing. It is the story of how the world was created by great ancestral beings. These beings shaped the mountains, carved the rivers, and made all the animals and plants. They also gave the people their laws, their ceremonies, and their responsibilities. The dreaming explains why things are the way they are. It is a guide for how to live, how to care for country, and how to relate to each other. It is the past, the present, and the future, all at once. This connection to the land or country was everything. People did not own the land in the European way. Instead, the land owned them. They belonged to a specific part of country. It was their mother, their home, and their responsibility. They had a duty to care for it, to perform the right ceremonies, and to protect it for future generations. Every part of the landscape was sacred. A rock formation was not just a pile of stones, it was the physical form of an ancestor. A river was not just a source of water, it was the path of a great serpent. This deep spiritual connection meant that being separated from their land was like losing a part of themselves. With hundreds of different nations across the continent, there was also a great diversity of languages. It is thought that there were once over 250 distinct languages, and many more dialects. Each language was unique and complex. It held the specific stories, songs, and knowledge of its people and their land. When a language is lost, it is not just words that disappear. A whole library of knowledge about the environment, about medicine, and about spirituality vanishes with it. This incredible linguistic richness shows just how diverse and sophisticated the societies of the first peoples were. They were not one single group, but a continent of many different cultures. Survival in this land required incredible skill and knowledge. The first peoples were experts in botany, zoology, and ecology. They knew which plants were good for food, which were good for medicine, and which could be used to make tools or shelters. They understood the seasons and the life cycles of animals. They could read the land like a book, finding water in the driest of deserts. This was not a simple or easy existence. It was a life built on a deep scientific understanding of the environment, passed down from one generation to the next. This knowledge allowed them to thrive in every part of this vast and challenging continent for tens of thousands of years. For a very long time, the great southern land was isolated from the rest of the world. But then, new shapes appeared on the horizon. They were tall ships with huge white sails, like ghosts on the water. The first Europeans to map parts of the coastline were the Dutch. In the 1600s, sailors like Willem Janszoon and Abel Tasman charted the western, northern, and southern coasts. They called this land New Holland. They saw a dry and rugged coast. They met some of the first peoples, but these encounters were often brief and full of misunderstanding. The Dutch did not see the richness of the land. They did not try to stay. They sailed away, leaving only new names on their maps. More than a century later, a different ship arrived on the east coast. This was the HMS Endeavour, commanded by a British captain named James Cook. In 1770, he sailed up the entire eastern side of the continent. He was a skilled mapmaker and navigator. With him was a botanist named Joseph Banks, who was amazed by the thousands of new plants and animals he saw. Cook and his crew landed at a place they called Botany Bay because of all the new plants. They met the local people, the Guigal clan. There was confusion, fear, and some conflict. The Guigal people tried to defend their country from these strangers who did not ask for permission to land. Cook continued his journey north. He mapped the coastline with great care. He gave English names to places that already had ancient names. He saw a land that he thought was green and promising. He noted the small fires and the few people he saw from his ship. He did not see the villages further inland. He did not understand the farming or the complex land management. Based on his observations, he made a very big decision. He decided that the land was terra nullius, a Latin term meaning land belonging to no one. He believed the first peoples were too few and too simple to have a real claim to the land. On a small island off the tip of Cape York, Captain Cook held a ceremony. He raised the British flag and claimed the entire east coast for King George III. He named it New South Wales. He did this without any treaty, discussion, or permission from the hundreds of thousands of people who already lived there. This single act, based on a deep misunderstanding of what he was seeing, would change the continent forever. It opened the door for the British to come and build a new society. For the first peoples, the arrival of these strange ships was the beginning of a long and difficult storm that was about to break over their land. The British government saw Captain Cook's New South Wales as a solution to a problem. Their prisons in England were overflowing. America, where they used to send their convicts, was no longer an option after it won its independence. So they decided to send them to the other side of the world. In 1788, a fleet of 11 ships, known as the First Fleet, arrived at Botany Bay. It was led by Captain Arthur Phillip. The ships were full of convicts, both men and women, as well as soldiers to guard them. They were not skilled farmers or builders. They were the poor and the desperate from Britain's overcrowded cities, sent to a land they knew nothing about. Captain Phillip soon realized Botany Bay was not a good place for a settlement. There was not enough fresh water, so he sailed a short way north and found a magnificent natural harbor. He called it Sydney Cove. This is where the new colony began. The first years were incredibly hard. The settlers did not understand the seasons or the soil. The seeds they brought from England failed to grow. They faced starvation and disease. They were isolated, a tiny group of strangers in a vast, unfamiliar land. The convicts were forced to do hard labor, clearing trees, building huts, and planting crops under the harsh rule of the soldiers. It was a society built on punishment and control. The arrival of the British was a disaster for the first peoples living around Sydney Harbour, the Eora people. The newcomers cleared the land, fenced it off, and stopped the Eora from fishing in their traditional waters. Diseases like smallpox, to which the first peoples had no immunity, spread rapidly and killed thousands. It was a terrible plague that wiped out whole communities. There was also violence. The British saw the first peoples as pests or obstacles. The Eora people, seeing their land and resources being stolen, fought back. They used guerrilla tactics to resist the invaders, but they were facing an enemy with guns. This pattern of disease, dispossession, and conflict would be repeated all across the continent. Despite the struggles, the colony slowly grew. More ships arrived with more convicts and some free settlers. Towns like Parramatta were established further inland. Farms began to spread out, taking more and more land. The colony was a place of great cruelty and hardship, but it was also a place where some people saw a chance for a new life. Convicts who served their time could be given a small plot of land. They started their own farms and businesses. A new society was being born, a tough and unequal society forged in chains. It was a society that was taking root on stolen land, and the conflict between the old world and the new was only just beginning. For the first few decades, the Australian colonies grew slowly. But in 1851, everything changed. A man named Edward Hargraves found gold near Bathurst in New South Wales. Soon after, even bigger goldfields were discovered in the new colony of Victoria, around places like Ballarat and Bendigo. When news of the gold reached the rest of the world, a massive rush began. Hundreds of thousands of people left their homes and sailed to Australia, all dreaming of finding a fortune. The population of the colonies exploded. In just 10 years, the number of people in Australia more than doubled. The country would never be the same again. The goldfields were chaotic and wild places. People from all over the world crowded together in sprawling camps of tents and rough huts. There were English, Irish, Scottish, and Welsh miners. There were Americans from the Californian gold rush, and there were thousands of Chinese miners who came seeking wealth to send back to their families. Life on the diggings was hard work. Miners spent all day digging in mud and water, hoping to find a nugget of gold. Some struck it rich overnight, but most people found very little and struggled to even make a living. It was a lottery, and the hope of winning kept people digging. This sudden flood of people brought great wealth to the colonies. The gold was used to build grand new buildings in the growing cities of Melbourne and Sydney. Roads and railways were built to connect the goldfields to the ports. But the gold rush also brought new problems. There was conflict on the goldfields. The government charged miners a high fee for a license to dig, whether they found gold or not. Many miners felt this was unfair. In 1854, at Ballarat, this anger boiled over. Miners built a wooden fort called the Eureka Stockade and raised a new flag with the Southern Cross. They fought a battle against government soldiers. The miners lost the battle, but their stand is now seen as an important moment in the fight for democracy in Australia. The gold rush also created social tensions. Many white miners were hostile towards the Chinese miners. They were jealous of their hard work and success. There were racist attacks and riots against the Chinese. The government passed laws to try and stop Chinese people from coming to Australia. This was the beginning of the White Australia policy, an idea that would shape the country for the next century. The gold rush transformed Australia from a remote prison colony into a wealthy and multicultural destination. It brought new people, new ideas, and new conflicts, setting the stage for the next chapter in the nation's story. By the end of the 1800s, Australia was not one country. It was 6 separate British colonies: New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia, and Tasmania. Each colony had its own government, its own laws, its own railway system, and even its own army. They acted like separate little countries. But some people started to think that it would be better if they all joined together. They argued that a single united nation would be stronger. It could have a common defense force to protect the continent. It could have a single policy on trade and immigration. The idea of federation began to grow. For many years, politicians from the different colonies met and debated. It was not an easy process. The smaller colonies were worried that the bigger, more powerful colonies like New South Wales and Victoria would dominate them. There were arguments about where the national capital city should be. There were disagreements about money and taxes. But slowly, over time, they worked out a plan. They wrote a constitution, a set of rules for how the new nation would be governed. This constitution was then put to the people of each colony to vote on. One by one, the colonies voted yes. They agreed to become one. On the first day of the new century, January 1st, 1901, the Commonwealth of Australia was born. Huge celebrations were held in cities and towns across the continent. The 6 colonies became states within the new nation. A new federal government was created to look after national issues like defence and immigration. But Australia was not yet a fully independent country. It was still part of the British Empire. The King or Queen of Britain was still Australia's head of state. Britain could still make laws for Australia, and the country's foreign policy was decided in London. The people thought of themselves as both Australian and British. This connection to Britain was tested in the 2 world wars. When Britain went to war, Australia automatically went to war too. Hundreds of thousands of young Australian men volunteered to fight. They fought at Gallipoli in Turkey, on the Western Front in France, and in the Pacific against Japan. These wars had a huge impact on the young nation. They brought great sadness and loss. But they also helped to forge a stronger sense of a unique Australian identity. After the wars, Australia began to see itself as more than just a junior partner to Britain. It started to act more independently on the world stage, slowly stepping out from under the shadow of the empire to become its own nation. The Australia of today is a very different place from the one that federated in 1901. After the Second World War, the country realized it needed more people. The government started a huge immigration program. At first it looked for migrants from Britain, but soon it welcomed people from all over Europe, from countries like Italy, Greece and Germany. Later it opened its doors to people from Asia, the Middle East and Africa. The old White Australia policy was finally left behind. This wave of migration has completely transformed the country. Australia is now one of the most multicultural societies in the world, a place where hundreds of different languages are spoken. This diversity has made Australia a richer and more vibrant place. It has changed the food we eat, the music we listen to, and the way our cities look and feel. But building a multicultural society is an ongoing journey. The country still works to make sure that everyone, no matter where they come from, feels welcome and has the same opportunities. Alongside this, there has been a slow but important change in the relationship with the First Peoples. For a long time, their history was ignored and their rights were denied. They were not even counted as citizens until a vote in 1967. They were taken from their land and their families. Now there is a growing recognition of the injustices of the past. In 2008, the Prime Minister made a formal apology to the stolen generations, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children who were forcibly removed from their families. There is a movement for a treaty between the government and the First Peoples. There is a push to recognize them in the Constitution and to give them a voice in the decisions that affect their lives. This process of reconciliation is difficult, and it is not finished. It involves telling the truth about the country's history and working towards a future where all Australians can walk together with respect. Today, Australia stands as a modern, independent nation with strong connections to its region and the world. It is a land of ancient stories and new beginnings. It is a country built by the oldest living culture on Earth, by British convicts and settlers, by gold seekers, and by migrants from every corner of the globe. Its story is complex, with moments of great sorrow and moments of great hope. The journey from an ancient land to a modern nation is not over. Australia is still figuring out its identity, still learning from its past, and still trying to build a fair and inclusive home for all the people who share this vast southern continent.